No, it's not. It's not possible to generalise about Indigenous cultures today, contemporary cultures today. There must be hundreds of different cultures across Australia, if there's not thousands. And that's because different languages used, where people are at in different places. Some people are back at the traditional end, still here in Arnhem Land. Right up to the other end where people have completely appropriated, taken on board all the silly naming that the mainstream, or you could say the settlers, how they named Aboriginal culture. They've taken all that on board as their culture. You know, hunter-gatherers, primitive, pagan, no understanding of economics. They've taken all that rubbish on board. Now, I shouldn't call it rubbish because that's where people are at now. That's their cultural beliefs. Like the use of the word "the dreaming." Where did the word "the dreaming" come from? It didn't come from Aboriginal people. It came from an English-speaking people. And they weren't even linguists. One was the Postmaster General in Alice Springs. Another one was an anthropologist. He didn't even speak the local language, and yet he named the Chukabaro Altjaringa as the dreaming. Hello. Why do we go with that? Because it fits that mystic view of Aboriginal people that the settlers created, that they were, in a sense, not real humans. They were more like mystic beings floating around, not owning the land, so we can take the land off them. And they don't really have a sense of law, so we can impose our law on them. They didn't have an economic system, so we can stop all their elements of trade and so forth. But they're just mystic people. They're just spiritual mystic people. Yes, they're spiritual people, but they're not like that. They did have an LAW. They did have parliaments. They did have systems of law. They did have social structures. They did have an economic base. They understood business through their traditional trading tracks and so forth. And the language that still survives in Arnhem Land today is quite clear that they were business people. Commerce was central to their way of life. Now people, how do you put that together with this mystic view of Aboriginal? We cannot generalise anything. Every group across Australia will have a slightly different culture. I work with people at the moment who speak Creole. I work with them basically on the phone because they're hundreds of k's away from me here, but they still have a commonness with everybody else, other Aboriginal people, even in Arnhem Land here. But their culture is very different. Their values are different. What they believe in is different. And if they come to a ceremony or like they bury people in 3 days down there around Catherine and so forth. 3 days. Now that's a pastoralist culture. The traditional burials were where people were put on a platform, and they would break, the body would break down, and then people would then come and clean up the bones and so forth, and then the bones would be kept until a time when people could come together and there was plenty of food and all that sort of stuff, and they could come together and they could have long mortuary ceremonies, which would go on for 30 years till the final event. Because in that 30 years there was ceremonial occasions and opportunities for people, the next generation, to learn about what the previous generations before did. So that transfer of knowledge was part of the mortuary service. Now, of course, when pastoralists came along, oh no, we're going to bury people in 3 days. So down in Catherine, they buried people in 3 days. In Arnhem Land, it's still a number of weeks in the ceremonial process, working through it. And then there's other factors. You could look across the cultures which are very different. People who live as Aboriginal people in Sydney, very completely different understanding about what is culture to them. But they still have family structures, which is very strong to them. It's not like the kinship system in Arnhem Land. It's mirrors some parts of it, but very different. So giving the big differences across Australia, no, we can't generalise them. We shouldn't generalise them. We shouldn't say, oh, we're all just Aboriginal people. Now that, I need to just put a bit of a caveat in here too, or a bit of warning here. And that means to say that mainstream Aboriginal people who now operate in the mainstream culture and the mainstream English and all, need to be very careful about how they set up policies and structures for very traditional people, because in some ways they're as much alien from it as other mainstream people, right? They have an affiliation towards those people, but be careful you don't become sub-oppressors. I have some nephews that are clearly that are Aboriginal people. But do they know anything about Yolngu people? They know nothing. They know nothing about them. They know nothing about their real needs. So we can't just say, oh, we now have an Aboriginal organisation. And government has even passed legislation now that we can have an Aboriginal company. And because they're called an Aboriginal company, they're now allowed to do things and get contracts that other people can't do. Just be careful with that, guys, because there's many different levels of culture. Therefore, there's many different levels of needs, and there's many different levels of how we should approach something. If we come back to the other end and we allow policies and that to be developed from the grassroots, where people can participate in real dialogue and have real conversations, then things will grow out of that, grow out of the people's conversation, out of the people's motivation to take control of their future. That's where policy development has to come from. Not just because it's an Aboriginal organisation or a group of Aboriginal people. We cannot generalise, and we shouldn't.